Unplugged In, Journalism and Press Freedom. Journalists facing challenges around the globe.
What we saw in the last year, and I'm talking about from the point of view of the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which documents press freedom violations in the U.S., was just an outstanding and incredible uptick in violations against journalists.
The murder of a former TV journalist exposes the dangers of the job in Afghanistan.
Afghan journalists, their bravery, that despite all threats, they still do their job of informing the public about what's going on in Afghanistan.
Keeping the world informed can be a dangerous work. Unplugged In, Global Press Freedom. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C. The truth is under attack. Those words are part of President Joe Biden's speech on May 3rd, the World Press Freedom Day. His remarks come as the yearly report by Reporters Without Borders showing that free-flowing journalism is partly or completely blocked in nearly 3/4 of the world's 180 nations. The United States, which has freedom of the press written into its Constitution, is improving over the past year, moving from 48th to 44th in the annual rankings. Last summer's protests over racial inequality in the U.S. saw several clashes by both law enforcement and protesters with members of the media. One nonprofit organization partnered with a civic group to help reduce tensions. VOA's Arash Erbasadi has more.
For journalists in Washington, the year started with the storming of the United States Capitol in January. Then, a pro-Trump mob tore down barricades and attacked journalists in their gear. That violence against journalists followed a summer in which millions protested the police killing of George Floyd, and police clashed sometimes violently with protesters and press. So Georgia law enforcement officials and the Georgia chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, or SPJ, saw the opportunity for a teaching moment.
What we have here is a protest situation where police are needing to diffuse the protesters. They're entering an area where they shouldn't, or things are starting to get violent and they need to. It's no longer peaceful.
I'm here live on the scene of a protest.
Former president of the Georgia SPJ, Charlotte Norsworthy, appears in this training video as a reporter before a mock crowd of protesters hostile toward police. The course at the Georgia Public Safety Training Center guides law enforcement to de-escalation instead of conflict, but it also teaches journalists to respect legal boundaries. Chad Wilson is Division Director for Basic Training. He says the program helps bridge the divide between law enforcement and media.
You really get to see that it's not just a person with a microphone in your face, or it's not just a person with a camera. From our perspective, they're human beings just like we are. And then from the media perspective, I think it's also important that they got to see that, there's a human being standing behind that shield wearing that helmet. And at the end of the day, we all want to just do our job.
Both Norsworthy and Wilson agree there is growing mistrust between journalists and law enforcement as police have increasingly become the subject of protest. Still, both are quick to call this training a well-received step in the right direction.
Well, I think so far it's been way more successful than we thought it was going to be to start with.
Police and journalists have rights that start and end at very specific time frames. And it is a two-way street that requires participation and respect from both police and the press. It won't work without that.
If we get nothing other than just open lines of communication out of this, I think we've done more than a lot of people have ever gotten done.
Justice! Wilson says the training also exposes officers from more rural areas to media presence they would typically not encounter. The physical program is new, but online training modules are available to all Georgia law enforcement. Arash Erbasadi, VOA News.
The Committee to Protect Journalists reports that in 2020, 274 journalists were arrested and imprisoned for their work. That's the most since the committee started tracking and working to protect journalists. Kirstin McCudden is the managing editor for the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. Her organization works to provide reliable and accessible information about press freedom violations in the United States. We spoke about the rights of journalists here in the U.S.
The First Amendment is still very strong comparatively. When you talk about the US versus other countries, journalists do have the right to move about freely. But what we saw in the last year, and I'm talking about from the point of view of the US Press Freedom Tracker, which documents press freedom violations in the US, was just an outstanding and incredible uptick in violations against journalists. And by that, Greta, I mean assaults. That's getting hit with a rubber bullet. I mean arrests, having their equipment damages, but also even the subpoenas, the subpoenas that we've documented against journalists have continued to go up every year since the tracker was launched. So journalists are facing these different threats in different ways.
The rubber bullets, are those directed, aimed generally at journalists, or are we being aggressive and we sometimes put ourselves in, deeper into it because we all really do want to get the story and get it as real as we can, as accurate as we can? Are we being reckless in some ways?
I don't know that I would use the word reckless, but we do document both, whether it was targeted or non-targeted. So we collect it all just in order to see what journalists are facing out there. But many came to us and said, I had a press pass. I was not standing anywhere near a protester, or I was, it was clear I had my shoulder camera on and I felt targeted. What's interesting is the majority of the attacks or assaults on journalists that we documented in 2020, 80% of them came from law enforcement. So you do have some coming from individuals. We see a lot of what we call camera hatred. Don't film us. You shouldn't be here. But the majority, 80%, did come from law enforcement.
I take it that these documented events are linked to protests.
You're right. You're 100% right. Protests have always been a dangerous place for journalists. That's been true throughout all of our documentation and really throughout journalists covering such get-togethers. There's a lot of activity. It's usually overnight. It's dark. But what we saw in 2020 was not just one protest. And what we're really talking about is post May 25th. On May 25th, George Floyd died in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in police custody. On May 26th, we saw our first assaults of journalists covering protests. And from May 26th through the end of the year, we saw hundreds and hundreds. In the end, we ended up documenting more than 430 assaults of journalists from protests. And that's not just in Minneapolis. It was 35 states across the US, more than 80 cities. So you're right, protests have always been dangerous. And that is where we saw the majority, not just of assaults, but also of arrests or detainments of journalists.
Is there a line that we journalists can't cross? I mean, I've covered protests over my life, and I've had cops come up to me and say, "Get out of here!" Get out of here. And I don't, and I like, when can I stay someplace? I mean, and when is it okay for the police to move me out of there?
So it's a great question, Greta, and it's by jurisdiction. So you should know your rights, where you can be, and that a journalist should not obstruct a police officer, but often you have the right to be on a sidewalk, on a public sidewalk. Most jurisdictions have exemptions for press. So there's always curfew, and you'll get asked the question, well, there was a curfew, why aren't journalists sent home as well? If you were out after curfew, then you are subject to the same penalties. And usually, not always, but usually there's a press exemption or a media exemption from a curfew. So it is dependent upon the journalist to know where you are and what your rights are in that area.
What is media? I mean, that seems to be, in the old days, it's probably, a couple print people. Now it's gone from print to electronic TV, to streaming, to blogging, to being citizen journalists. I mean, who gets within that umbrella? I imagine it's jurisdiction, but the umbrella of being media exemptions to curfews.
We have a pretty wide definition of a journalist because we think that the wider the umbrella is actually protects more people. That is anybody who's there to document. We ask them if they are outwardly showing press. Do you have press written on you? Are you affiliated with any press groups by chance? You don't have to carry a press pass. And you're right, not everybody has that fedora anymore with the little press hat, and you don't call up the rewrite desk anymore. It's not like that. But the the larger protection for more people to be able to document actually upholds the First Amendment even better. So if you are there to document, if you hold yourself out as press, as media, if you are sharing your documentation with the public, that is what we consider being a journalist for that day.
Turkey was once seen as a growing democracy in the Middle East. Now it is among the world's top jailers of journalists. Recent decisions by media companies to comply with Turkey's controversial social media laws are raising more concerns about press freedom in the country. From Istanbul, VOA's Dorian Jones tells us more.
In the Istanbul office of news portal 98 Haber, the latest news reports are compiled by both professional and citizen journalists. The news site relies on social media, which has become the main platform for independent reporting in Turkey.
90% of the whole media apparatus is in control of the state, of the government in Turkey. There is no a mainstream in Turkey anymore. It's this apparatus of the government against the society, so the people can follow trustworthy news through social media.
The Paris-based group Reporters Without Borders this month ranked Turkey 153 in terms of media freedom. Yet Turkey's government wants to extend its control of media to the internet by pressuring social media platforms to open offices in Turkey. This will put companies' operations in the country under Turkish jurisdiction, with controls that Ankara claims are similar to those of other European countries. Advocates see some similarities to legislation being considered in Europe, but question how Turkey will apply such restrictions.
The government, in addition to warnings and financial penalties and advertisement ban, was going to impose a bandwidth restriction ban. The government was going to throttle the servers of these social media platform providers who did not comply with having legal representation in Turkey.
Twitter, Google, Facebook, TikTok and others have opened offices in Istanbul, meeting an April deadline. Twitter says Turkey submits the most requests to remove postings and users, but up to this point the company has complied with only a few. However, news portals like 98 Haber fear these social media platforms will become more compliant with Turkish authorities.
If these social media companies become a tool to increase this oppression in Turkey, then it will become an even bigger challenge for us. And this is the biggest concern we have at the moment.
Several social media platforms have issued statements saying they remain committed to freedom of expression. Meantime, 98 Haber is expanding its operations ahead of expected early elections in Turkey. It and others are banking on social media platforms remaining free and open. Dorian Jones for VOA News, Istanbul.
Since February, violence in Myanmar has escalated. That's when the military conducted a coup of the democratically elected government. Journalists covering that coup have faced internet blackouts and arrests on charges of inciting protests. The media crackdown has broader implications for how people in the region get their news. In February, New York Times columnist Kara Swisher and I discussed this. Well, if you look at like Myanmar, where there's recently a political coup, they've taken down the internet. They've taken people off Facebook and Twitter. And you see parts of in India right now where there's a protest about farmers. There's another problem taking down. I mean, how do Twitter and Facebook handle these international problems?
Well, not well. I mean, I think that's the issue. They're so complex. In Myanmar, that's happened several times. There's a lot of incidents of Facebook doing a bad job monitoring its platform and then riots and deaths resulting. That was several years ago. In this case, the governments really want to control the flow of information, and most people get their news from Facebook. It's like it's some number in the 90s of how many people get their daily news from Facebook. It's pretty high in the United States. And so they definitely want to control the flow of information, the ability to organize and things like that. In other cases, like in the Philippines, the government uses it to put out false information about its opponents. And so it can be used both in ways that are good for dictators and bad for dictators. And so they want to control it.
Harassment and assaults against female reporters are impacting the push for equality in Bangladesh. In this year's World Press Freedom Index, Bangladesh is ranked 152nd out of 180 countries. The low ranking is raising concern for journalists on assignment there. Here's a report from VOA's Bangla service.
Mobs surrounding and harassing media during protests by fundamentalist or Islamist groups. Bangladesh is seeing more incidents like this, prompting female journalists and their news managers to rethink personal safety and the risk of covering some stories. Earlier this year, members of the Hifazat-e-Islam Islamist group attacked Ghazi TV's Rubina Yasmin during protests against a visit by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Some activists came to me and asked why I was dressed in men's clothes. I did not want to engage in any argument at that moment, fearing for my life, even though I was wearing a bulletproof vest. They complained that I was not wearing a veil.
It is becoming difficult for women journalists in Bangladesh to survive, says Nadia Sherman, a crime reporter for Channel 71.
Women journalists are usually seen as not so important. Very few media outlets in Bangladesh have moved away from that notion. Many media officials are proud to say that their organization does not hire women.
Female journalists are doing good work, and dedication, professionalism are driving them forward, says Shakil Ahmed, head of news for Channel 71. But Ahmed says he worries about the risk of attack out in the field.
I have to think multiple times before signing a woman on a risky assignment. Even 5 years back, they could easily cover these kinds of assignments, but now the scenario has changed a lot. My worry is the lifelong impact a mob attack could have on a female reporter.
The risk factor in assigning a female journalist to some stories is impacting the fight for equality, says journalist Ishrat Jahan Urmi.
When women are being physically attacked and have life-threatening injuries, how can one fight for equal rights? I think these incidents are instigating women to stop fighting for their rights.
Despite the challenges, women journalists in Bangladesh say they will keep working to win their fight for equality. Sanjana Feroz, VOA News, Washington.
Female journalists in Pakistan face constant challenges, including men who tell them they do not belong in the industry. Our VOA correspondent in Peshawar, Pakistan, met with two women journalists, including a 20-year news veteran who says at first she was not allowed to cover big stories such as politics and terrorism.
When she started out in journalism, Farzana Ali from Pakistan's conservative Dera Ismail Khan district in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa was told women don't belong in the profession. But she pushed back and is now the first female bureau chief of Aaj News in Peshawar, the province's capital.
In the beginning, I was told, men don't do the kind of things you are doing, or even, men don't dare say no to us. Who was I to say no to them? Well, look, I'm not a thing. I am a journalist, and it is my job to convey information to the people.
The 20-year news veteran says women were not allowed to cover politics, terrorism, and other big issues, but she stepped up to take on those beats. Now, as bureau chief, a top worry is the safety of her team, especially in districts with extremism and terrorism.
If it seems to us that our lives will be in trouble, mine, my reporters, anyone working with me, especially those working in merged districts, then we advise them to report only that news that would not risk their lives. That is why many issues go unreported.
Other female journalists say whatever the subject, reporting from the field can be more difficult for female journalists.
When I go in the field to report, people harass me, calling me names and staring at me. The way they stare makes you feel uncomfortable. I am sitting here like this, but in the field, I cover myself in a shawl.
But in some cases, Ali says being a female journalist actually helps give depth to their reporting, especially on women's issues.
You get access to the original stories. If a man goes, he will talk to men only. A male reporter will never tell the negative side of the story about a woman's issues. I, on the other hand, would bring what a woman really has to say.
In Pakistan, one challenge exists for all journalists in the country: access to information.
It's said that we have freedom of expression in Pakistan. Everyone can say what is on their mind. But I'm not ready to accept that. You don't have access to information, you don't have access to areas, so where is the freedom of expression and where is the freedom of press?
Still, these journalists vow to keep pushing to fully cover the issues that affect their communities. For Omar Farooq in Peshawar, Pakistan, Bejan Hamdard, VOA News.
With the U.S. military set to withdraw from Afghanistan by September 11th, threats against and attacks on journalists by the Taliban have increased. Last month, 3 female journalists were killed, and days ago, a former TV news anchor was also killed. These deaths are a reminder of the dangers journalists face every day in Afghanistan. VOA's Bejan Hamdard has that story.
In Afghanistan's southern province of Kandahar, former Tolo News anchor Nemat Rawan, who recently joined the country's Ministry of Finance as a media official, was gunned down early Thursday. 28-year-old Rawan is the 5th journalist to be killed in the country this year. Local journalists are demanding an immediate investigation.
We are extremely concerned because this is not the first time that a journalist has been killed in Kandahar and the region. Previously, we had more journalists killed in Helmand. The situation has got intense because the previous day, the Taliban had issued new threats to journalists, and then there were reports that the head of NDS also made threatening remarks. The journalists are very concerned, and their lives are in danger.
Journalists should not be killed, as they are the people who report on the public's problems.
Although the Taliban have not claimed responsibility for Rawan's killing, the death comes a day after the Taliban accused media in Afghanistan of taking sides and issued a warning. Afghan government officials say the Taliban should focus on the peace process instead of issuing threats. Presidential spokesperson Fatima Murchal.
We don't support the situation of militarism and war in Afghanistan. Our priority is peace. Taliban have intensified their attacks but have lost the war in each battleground. So the time has come for Taliban to understand the realities of the situation on the battleground instead of wrong calculation of winning the fight, useless attacks, and threatening journalists.
At the same time, an Afghan lawmaker tweeted that the chief of the country's intelligence agency made comments in a closed meeting warning journalists against news coverage that appeared favorable to the Taliban. Media advocacy group NICE chief says it is not in either side's benefit to threaten a free press.
Neither side has the right to threaten media and journalists. Any threat against media and journalists at the time when we are moving towards peace can hurt media and the peace process.
Under increasing pressure from the Taliban and the government, some Afghan journalists are appealing to the international community for help.
The Taliban didn't specify which media or which reporter is violating, but we are in a very sensitive time of peace talks. We want the international community, especially the U.S., to bring the discussion of freedom of press and supporting media into the peace talks so we don't face threats like this in the future.
We are worried. The situation is worrisome as journalists endure pressure from both sides and have sacrificed so much. We are being killed. We want the U.S. and the international community to take a constructive step to improve the current situation and play a positive role in the peace process. Otherwise, we will lose the 20-year gains for freedom of expression in this country.
According to the Afghan Journalists Safety Committee, 43 Afghan journalists have left the country and over 1,000 others have given up on their profession due to the increase in targeted killings in the last 6 months. For Azizullah Popol in Kandahar, Hikmat Surosh and Jalal Mirzad in Kabul, Afghanistan, Bejan Hamdard, VOA News.
Despite threats of violence and actual violence, Afghanistan's independent news media has thrived. It has been a force for debate and accountability over the past 2 decades. Najib Sharifi leads the Afghan Journalists Safety Committee. This is an independent group working to protect media workers in the region. We spoke earlier about the challenges reporters are facing and what this moment means for the future of Afghanistan's free press.
Well, in the past couple of years, Afghanistan has been one of the most dangerous countries for journalists. We have had a lot of casualties in the past couple of years, but it became the turning point was November 2020, where a targeted killing of journalists started. This was unprecedented in the history of Afghanistan, and as far as I know, in the history of the world. Journalists have not been, such kind of targeted killings have not taken place anywhere else. However, what's really, really admirable is that Afghan media is still producing content. They're still reporting. Afghan journalists, their bravery, that despite all threats, they still do their job of informing the public about what's going on in Afghanistan. This is very admirable, but I do remain concerned about the future of press freedom in Afghanistan, and we have to keep in mind that this is one of the greatest achievements of the past 2 decades, so we can't afford to lose it.
What happened in November of 2020 that journalists became targeted? Was there some particular event? That's the first question. And the second question is, who's doing the killing?
Well, we really don't know what basically led to the onset of targeted killing of journalists. A particular policy change or policy decision or, tactical decision. But, what I believe could have a role in the decision of, to start targeted killing of journalists was, the peace deal that the Taliban had with the U.S., which basically prohibits them from, launching major attacks in the major cities. So obviously, targeted killing was not one of the prohibitions in the agreement. And I believe, that could be a reason. Who is doing this? That's a very difficult question. Well, the government blames the Taliban. The international community blames the Taliban. The diplomatic missions in their statements have publicly, stated that we understand that, that the Taliban are doing this, and we call on the Taliban to stop doing this. However, the Taliban have consistently kept denying. But we look at the past. Obviously, the Taliban have had their contribution in terms of killing of journalists.
What about women journalists? Are they at greater risk? Are there a number of women journalists there?
Well, we do have a significant number of women journalists, which is basically a source of pride for us, because it's very, very important, that we have a good presence of, women in the media sector in Afghanistan. However, in the past 6-7 months, since the onset of targeted killing of journalists, we have noticed that women journalists are more vulnerable than male journalists. Because, we wanted to analyze why women, all of a sudden, this trend shifts and women become bigger targets. The only solution or the only answer that we came up with was because of its, emotional effect, that when a woman journalist is killed, obviously the emotional impact is much greater than when a male journalist is killed. So, they run greater risk right now.
That's all the time we have for now. Thank you to my guests, Managing Editor of the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, Kirstin McCudden, and Afghan Journalists Safety Committee leader, Najib Sharifi. Stay up to date on the latest news at voanews.com and follow me on Twitter @Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.